Today, I'm going to share 3 true stories where the facts in these stories are so bizarre, people today are still trying to explain them. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do. On the night of June 12, 1993, 69-year-old Deke Slayton climbed into bed in his home in League City, Texas. And even this small action, getting in bed, took a lot of effort for Deke because he was very, very sick. So Deke had a brain tumor. He'd actually been diagnosed the year before, but had then quickly gone into remission, so he thought he'd beaten it. But it had unfortunately come back a few months later, and this time it was much worse. Deke knew eventually this thing was going to kill him, and unfortunately, probably sooner than later. His wife and daughter had been taking care of him as he got weaker and sicker. And while he certainly appreciated it, the reality is it really bothered him. I mean, he was a tough guy, and he was used to being the person who took care of other people, not the other way around. But more than that, the worst part of him getting sick was he hadn't been able to fly a plane in months. So Deke was like a legend in the aviation community. As a young man, he'd been in the Air Force, and he'd flown in World War II combat missions, some of the most harrowing aerial combat in recorded history. And Deke had loved being up high and looking down at the world from his cockpit so much that after the war was over, he'd gone one step further, to space. And he had not just become a regular astronaut. He'd been on NASA's first team of astronauts to literally ever go to space. And then after he had gotten too old for space trips, he continued to work for NASA in various capacities until his retirement 10 years ago. But retiring had not meant he just stopped, aerial travel completely. I mean, he was done flying into space, but he still flew planes. In fact, he was a hugely successful amateur air racer, which is a competitive sport where aircraft race one another through basically an aerial obstacle course. And so now, as Deke's life was sort of slipping through his fingers, all he found himself wanting to do was just go fly. He had this plane called a Stinger, which he used for racing. It was this red, small plane that was super loud, pretty unique, but he loved this plane, and he just constantly fantasized about getting back in the cockpit and going for a ride. However, Deke did know that because of his tumor, realistically, him flying a plane would not be safe. His speech was shaky, and he was tired all the time. Also, his balance and decision-making were affected. And then on top of the physical limitations from his tumor, also there was the reality that his Stinger plane was currently in storage. But as Deke laid in bed that night, feeling just physically awful and, literally feeling his life sort of slipping away, all he wanted was just one more time to fly. And it just became so overpowering, that desire to fly again, that he decided while he was laying there that tomorrow, first thing in the morning, whether I am sick or not, getting up, I'm taking my Stinger out of storage, and I am going for a ride. Early the next morning, at the John Wayne Airport in Southern California, which was over 1,500 miles away from where Deke lived, an airport manager stepped into his office ready to start a shift. He worked for the airport's noise abatement department, which was responsible for making sure that the planes that flew in and out didn't make too much noise and drive the neighbors crazy. And usually, this early in the morning, things were pretty calm and uneventful. But today, as soon as the manager got into his office, he heard his desk phone ring. And when he answered it, the person on the other end said they were a local resident and they wanted to make a complaint. There had just been a plane flying low over her house, making a ton of noise. The manager immediately looked over at the clock and saw it was just before 8 a.m., which meant that the plane that this resident was complaining about was in violation of the airport's curfew. John Wayne Airport had a policy where they didn't let any planes take off before 8 a.m. on Sundays, specifically to avoid bothering the locals too early. And so on the phone, this, perturbed resident gave a description of the aircraft, which was a small, red racing Stinger. And so the manager took some notes, hung up, and was about to, start making some phone calls when their phone rang again. And it was another resident with basically the exact same complaint. And then after that, this manager got more and more calls all about this red plane. And all the people who were complaining basically said they had heard it, they had seen it. It was like doing these crazy aerial maneuvers, but now it was gone. So they were calling sort of after the fact. It's gone now, but it was really, really disruptive. Some of the callers actually said that at certain points, this plane, when they saw it, had flown so low, they were able to read its identification number, and they had written it down to report it. So they told the manager that it was N21X. That was the number on this plane. And so at some point, when the manager had a chance, in between all these calls they were getting, they looked up on their computer to see who this plane was registered to, using that number, N21X. And when they saw whose plane this was, the manager was shocked. This was Deke Slayton's plane. The manager knew Deke. Everybody did. And it was very surprising to him that somebody like Deke, who was a consummate professional, would be flying around so recklessly outside of curfew. That's crazy. So on his computer, the manager pulled up the morning's readings from the airport's noise monitors. When the manager saw the readings, he could see very clearly that at least 3 monitors had gone way up at the same time the residents all said they saw Deke's plane. And so at this point, the manager knew that because of these noise recordings, which corroborated the reports, that he would have to send, the legend himself, Deke, a formal note about doing this. He was basically going to have to reprimand Deke. However, based on all the reports and also on those monitors which measured the noise in the area, it seemed apparent that Deke, whatever he was doing, he was done doing it now because he was out of the airspace. And so, this manager would have to reprimand him, but there wasn't a huge urgency. But he would have to do it eventually. So the manager printed out the recordings, put them on a stack of things to do, and then just went about his day. 15 days later, that manager finally got around to actually sending that warning to Deke. And when Deke's wife got that letter and read its contents, she was so confused because what this airport was claiming Deke did was literally impossible. It would turn out there was literally no way Deke Slayton could have been flying his Stinger over the California skies on that day, because the storage location that was holding Deke's plane was actually a museum in Nevada. He'd given the Stinger to them 3 years ago, and it hadn't moved since. And just to make it clear here, they had removed the engine from the Stinger and then hung the Stinger from the rafters in this museum. This thing is not flyable, at least not quickly. But more than the logistics of how quickly could he get the plane out of the museum, put the engine back in, and make it fly ready, beyond that, that's a huge problem. But the other, far bigger reason that it was truly impossible that Deke was the one flying that plane, even though clearly it was his plane, the tail number said as much, the reason it couldn't have been him is because 5 full hours before that recorded flight, Deke had passed away in his sleep. No one has ever been able to explain how Deke's red Stinger plane ended up over the skies of California that morning. It just doesn't make any sense. And today, that warning letter that the manager from the John Wayne Airport sent to Deke, that ultimately his wife got and was so confused by, that letter actually sits on display at the Deke Slayton Memorial Space Museum.